should say, Leon DeLange's mother was one of my son's favorite school teachers. Yeah. And I should say something with your mention of Rehoboth. My wife and I have 3 children, 2 born to us, 1 child regarded hard to place that we adopted. We adopted a little girl, 5 weeks old, a Navajo. She's gone full circle, is back at Rehoboth, and is superintendent of the school.
Wow.
And when I was 15, I had a pen pal from Rehoboth.
Oh, yeah. I worked with a fellow there. My wife and I were just there for 2 weeks of volunteer work. I met a Navajo there who tells me he's a 4th generation Christian.
Sure.
Think of how far that goes back.
Was it 1905?
His daughters, he, his father, his great-grandfather. And what an interesting operation that is. Always welcome there, always things going on. You never know what the weather's going to be because it's high altitude. A few years ago, we left there on a January morning, and it was 21 degrees below 0.
Wow.
The 2 weeks we were there now, it was 60 degrees above 0. I'd like all of you to have Bibles available, if you can. I want to just spend a night doing some questions with you. And I preface by saying, remember, I'm doing questions, and then we'll look at some passages. First of all, you realize what an odd book the Bible is? How many books are in it?
66.
Whoa! I'll hand you a book with 66 chapters in it, things, and ask you to read it. Now, are they in chronological order? Oh. Where do I start reading?
That I can see.
Are you going to say to somebody, well, simple, like any other book. Start with Genesis and keep going. I have a hunch you might get stuck in Numbers and Leviticus. If I ask you, in the New Testament, where should you start?
Revelation.
I bet you wouldn't probably start Revelation, I don't know.
That's the best story ever told.
Yeah. Now, then I ask you another question. How do we know what Jesus said? You know, they didn't have tape recorders back there. And they didn't have iPhones. And they didn't have shorthand. How do we know what Jesus said? You realize that in a lot of cultures, they're oral cultures. I tell you something once and you remember it. I worked with Wycliffe Bible translators one summer and had a story from a fellow who worked in New Guinea. He says, we would go sit every night at the fire, and this elderly woman, he says, to me she looked to be 100, but I don't know who she was. She was the leader of the tribe. And for 3 hours, she would recite the story of that tribe. And he says, skeptical of me, I'm thinking, is she making it up? Is what she's saying tonight the same as what she said last night? So he says a few times I would interrupt her, and she could pick up right where she left off. And then one night, he says, I took a tape recorder along and tape recorded her 2-hour presentation. The following night, I listened to her to tell the story while I had a microphone in my ear. You know, he says, for 2 hours she was word for word. Can't you imagine those early people that knew Jesus saying, we've got to tell that story. We're still alive. We've got to start that story going out there. Now, how many people could write?
Not many.
When does the printing press come? About 1,500. That means before that, a lot of that was going on, being recited, being handwritten. And by the way, would you do me a favor? Write out a copy of the Bible for me. How long would that take?
A long time.
A long, I don't know the answer.
A lifetime.
But there you've got to think about scribes who every day are sitting there writing carefully. And some of them have just beautiful handwriting. I know a little bit of how long it takes because when I was in graduate school, my wife worked for a graduate professor who asked her to type a 15th century copy of a Latin Bible into modern Latin. You know how long it takes to type the New Testament? And how carefully you got to be reading all the way. So I just say, first of all, reflect on all the people before us who helped give us the Bible. By telling the story, by sharing it with others, by writing it down, by reducing it to printing. And people today who are still translating the Bible to people who don't have it in their language. You know how many languages there are today? Only 6,000. Now, we live English. We've got all kinds of Bibles, different versions. Some places, you're still waiting for it to come. When I was at Rehoboth, I talked with the translator. He says, Paul, I got a few questions. I'm working in a certain tribe, and I'm wondering how we handle such and such a passage. Now, tonight, I want to reflect on the Gospels. First of all, how many of the authors of the Gospels were disciples of Jesus? I'm going to ask you some questions. You're going to say, I got to think about it. Matthew, was he?
Yeah.
Mark?
No.
Luke?
No.
John?
Yes.
Oh, 2 out of 4. Take your Bibles and turn to Luke chapter 1. I want to just show you something fascinating. And you know, feel free to interrupt me, to ask questions anytime you want. Luke chapter 1. My fingers don't work as well on pages as they used to. Look at Luke chapter 1. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke says, I know some of those people. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. I wonder how long it took Luke to produce that first copy. And now we have that copy that we continue to use today. And have you ever thought of what a luxury it is to have 4 Gospels? I wish we had 4 copies of the book of Genesis, so that we could see some of the stories we say there's reference to it, but I wonder how it really went. I don't want to get complicated, but I remember Abraham meets a fellow we hardly hear of, Mephibosheth. Not Mephibosheth, Melchizedek, I'm sorry. And it says he's priest to the Most High God. Were there more followers of God back there than Abraham and some of them? Of course. I say, with the Gospels, we have 4. What a luxury. Now, tell me, if you had to write a Gospel, what would you include? That takes a little thinking. What's important and what isn't that important? Should every gospel have the Lord's Prayer? Maybe they should, but they don't. Should every gospel have the Beatitudes? They don't. Let's turn now to the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark. First one's Matthew, then Mark, then Luke, then John.
There's 16 chapters in
Notice how, right up front, he tells you what he's going to say. The beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Oh, we know what's coming. Now, what would you expect next? The story of Jesus' birth? He never mentions it. What does he mention next?
John the Baptist.
A quotation from Isaiah about John the Baptist, who's going to prepare the way for the Messiah in the wilderness. Now, verse 4, so John came, baptizing in the desert region, and preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And notice, gobs of people come out for him to be baptized. Don't you love the clothes he wears? Clothing made of camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. Now, we probably don't pick that up. That's what Elijah did. John the Baptist is walking in the footsteps of Elijah. And notice, too, how powerfully John is impressed by Jesus with verse 7. This was his message. After me will come one more powerful than I, the thongs of whose sandals I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. You know, Jewish people were expected to do everything except open somebody else's sandals. Can you imagine in a dusty, dirty culture what people's feet were like?
Oh, dirty.
Dirty?
Gross.
I'll bet they smelled. I'll bet they were gross. And John says, I'm telling you, there's someone coming ahead of me that I wouldn't even be worthy to take care of his shoes. Now, jump to verse 9. How old is Jesus when he's baptized, roughly?
30.
Whoa, 8 verses. We've just used 30 years. I often tease college students, I'll give you flat A on a paper if you write me a good paper on the teenage life of Jesus. How much do you know about Jesus when he's young?
Nothing.
Goes to the temple when he's 12 years old. Here you jump 30 years and you're Jesus being baptized. Look at that. As Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, you are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. That's God talking to Jesus. And what happens next? At once. By the way, Mark loves to use at once, immediately, quickly. What does the Spirit do to Jesus?
Takes him to the wilderness.
I sometimes playfully say, with friends like that, you don't need enemies. You just hear you're the Son of God, you're just ready to go, and the Spirit says, okay, into the desert. How long is he there?
40.
40 days, 40 nights.
And you notice, he doesn't give you the temptations like you have in the other Gospels. Make stones to bread, do this, do that. At once, the Spirit sent him out into the desert. And he was in the desert 40 days, being tempted by Satan. Wow. Imagine meeting Satan head on for 40 days. Now, what happens to the temptation? Who wins? Mark would say, did you hear me say that the Spirit came down and dwelt on Jesus? When Jesus, with the Spirit on him, comes into the desert and meets Satan, Satan's going to have a bad day. Notice how it says Jesus was with the wild animals and angels attended him. And there it is. So quickly. We know who Jesus is. We know he's God's Son. We know he's powered by the Spirit. And we know he's on his way to ministry. Now, just move along. I'm going to skip around a little. Move to verse 21 of chapter 1. They went to Capernaum. And when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to preach. The people were turned off by his teaching. No. The people were amazed at his teaching. Because he taught them as one who had authority. And then what does Mark stick in? Not as the teachers of their law. You know how the Jewish rabbis taught. You ask me a question, I'm a rabbi, and I don't answer it, but I say, well, Rabbi so-and-so said, and on the other hand, Rabbi so-and-so said, and so-and-so said, and I just throw all of the options. Jesus teaches them with authority. Just then, a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And then what does Jesus say? That's going to be a puzzle in in Mark. So many times where Mark will say, don't go and tell now. You got to wait around until the story is full. But 27, the people were also amazed that they asked each other, what is this? A new teaching, and with authority. He even gives orders to evil spirits, and they obey him. News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. And now just read on a little bit. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, so they told Jesus about it. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. Now watch this. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons. But what? Don't talk about me. If demons are telling you who I am, my people may not be sure who I am. So he says, don't go and say more. Now, for one that stretches us on our evangelism. Verse 35. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him. And when they found him, they said, everyone is looking for you. And Jesus says, let's have a revival. No, he doesn't. What does he say?
Let's go somewhere else.
Guys, we got to move. Let us go elsewhere to the nearby villages so I can preach there. That is why I have come. So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. I wonder how many years that took, or months that took. This isn't just a few verses. He went throughout Galilee, doing all that. Read on. And I could point out so many places. Let's turn to chapter 3. In fact, let's pick up with chapter 2, verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. And as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is lawful on the Sabbath? He says, haven't you ever read about David, what he did when his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, ate the bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. And you know, he even gave it to some of his commanders. And he said, remember, the Sabbath wasn't made for man, or was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Then, chapter 3. Another time he went into the synagogue. I can imagine when he comes into the synagogue, some of those Jewish leaders say, ooh, wonder what he's going to do this time. I bet this isn't going to be our most peaceful time. So there's a man with a shriveled hand. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, come out now and go stand behind church where nobody sees us, and I'll heal you. No, he doesn't. Look what he says. Hey, buddy, stand out in front of everybody. Then Jesus says, now, for you people out there, what's lawful in the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save a life or to kill? That they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said, stretch out your hand. And his hand was completely restored. Then, and now Mark tells you where his gospel is going to end. What does he say next? Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with Herodians how they might kill Jesus. You could stop reading the Gospel of Mark at this point and say, I know how it's going to end. I don't know all the details. But Jesus is going to die because he's shaking the system and doing what people don't like. Now, I'll page along. If I say I want to keep this light. Chapter 5. Somebody comes to him and said, there's a little daughter who's dead. Now, I'm about verse 40. He put them all out, took the child's father and mother, and the disciples who were with him, and he went in where the child was. He took her by the hand, and he said, in Hebrew, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished, and now notice, he gave strict orders what? Why? What do you think? I think Jesus is saying, you know, if I only heal people of physical diseases, they won't know who I really am. They have to go along long enough to find that I'm not just coming to cast out demons. I'm not just coming to heal children. I'm coming to die, to rise, and to do more. But I say it's fascinating how many times Jesus will do something and then say, but keep it to yourself. Now, jumping way ahead, chapter 8. Chapter 8, 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he said. "What do you say?" What does Peter answer?
You're on that Messiah.
And what do you expect Jesus to say? "Way to go! You got it!" What does he say? He warned them not to tell anyone. Why? Read on. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, that he must be killed and after 3 days rise. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. When do we take somebody aside? If you did something really dumb, I probably wouldn't say in class, you know, that was really dumb. I'd probably say, why don't you step outside and I'll talk there. Peter is so sure that Jesus is off the wall that he takes him aside and begins to rebuke him. And now notice what Jesus says. When Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan. You don't have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." And then he goes on. He says, if you want to come after me, you have to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Now, we looked at Mark 8, verse 31. Let's look at Mark 9, verse 31. We'll actually start with verse 9, verse 30. They left that place, passed through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he'll rise. Now notice, they didn't understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him. They are off the wall. Now, they come into a house at Capernaum. He asks a dumb question. What were you guys talking about? What's the answer? Who's the greatest? You're talking about who's the greatest when I'm saying I'm going to Jerusalem to die on a cross? Where are you guys? And then move along to chapter 10. 10 verse 33. Again he took the 12 and said, we're going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They'll condemn him to death and will hand him to the Gentiles. And now, here come the two hoof-and-mouth disciples. James and John, they come to Jesus with what question? First, you see how modest they are? We want you to do for us whatever we ask. I'd like to ask you that. Well, what do you want me to do? He said. Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory. You don't know what you're talking about. You see how Mark is showing how long it takes for people sometimes to get in tune with what Jesus is teaching. Not just people out there, but even some of his own followers. I'll end with the end of the book, chapter 16. Now, in your Bibles, how many verses does chapter 16 have?
20.
20, but what before it?
19.
It stops at 8.
Do you have a note in your text, like
Yeah.
NIV does, that it stops? The most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses don't have this last part. The question is, did Mark end his gospel there, or did something get lost? But now, go just before that. The women have gone to the resurrection, or to the grave. Verse 6, a young man says, you're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's risen, he's not here. See the place where they laid him. Go tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Now, what's the last verse? Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. It takes a bit of time for them to start to realize, hey, that tomb really was empty. You know, some people are saying Jesus is alive. I think what Mark does in his Gospels is shows how it takes time to come to a full understanding of who Jesus is. Because we like to make the quick statements. And here, even at the end, it takes a while before they come around. And then you have Mark and the others writing their gospel story. Questions or reflections? I always enjoy reading the Bible inquisitively because we often overlook things and don't pay attention. Oh, every gospel will have the story of Jesus' birth. Every gospel will have the Lord's Prayer. The disciples knew from the beginning who Jesus was. The women always understood what Jesus was doing. It shows how faith takes time and how that early church struggled, how they argued, and then they come around and say, now we know who our Messiah is. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we read that gospel story, and what a story it is, with people who are blown away by the power of Jesus they see, who sometimes follow him for the wrong reasons. And yet we watch that as time goes on, they come to realize that Jesus didn't only do mighty deeds. He went to a cross. He was beaten. He was crucified. He was buried. And yet he comes back with resurrection and says, lo, I'm with you always to the end of the world. And for that we give you praise. Amen.
Amen.
Wouldn't you like to stand here and be able to imagine all of the Christians who've gone before us, what their situations were, what their joys were, what their hurts were, what their stories were on how they became a Christian. And in all of that, God says to everybody, may the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, may the love of God, and may the fellowship of the Holy Spirit go with each one of you and all of them. Amen.
Amen.